Hi everybody, my name's Julia from Bobbins and Buttons, and this is part 2 of my guide for complete beginners if you're looking to start making your own clothing. So in the first part I covered the very starting point and a few tips and tricks for things to look for. So in this part I'm going to talk about the pattern. So in the last part of this series I talked about a pattern being the starting point for making your garment. So just to recap, the pattern is a template that you will cut out and attach to the fabric and cut round, and those pieces will then join together to become your garment. And I talked about the different types of patterns, commercial patterns and independent patterns. So commercial patterns will often be printed out on this soft tissue paper, and independent patterns are often printed onto a thicker paper. So I also mentioned there are PDF patterns and paper patterns. So the ones I've just shown you are typical paper patterns. So if you order a paper pattern, you'll get everything delivered to you in an envelope with the instructions and the templates all inside the pattern envelope. But if you order a PDF downloadable pattern, you are going to download the file yourself, and you can either then send that file to a specialist printer that will print sewing patterns, and there's lots of them around, but it needs to be a pattern printer that can do A0 size printing, or you will also get an A4 size printable file. So with that you literally print it off your own printer at home, and then it will have marks around the pattern where you can cut the lines down and stick the pieces together. So you will still end up essentially with a great big sheet of paper like this, but you will have had to stick it together yourself. So you'll have all your pieces stuck together to create one great big piece like that. So once you have your paper pattern ready to cut down to size, you're going to need to work out which size to cut it down to. So that's where the size charts within the pattern information come in. So I talked a little bit about how patterns are created, but it's really worth taking a bit of time and looking over the measurement charts and just seeing where you fit in to the size chart. It might be that you cross over 2 or 3 sizes, or children, as far as children are concerned, they might be a lot taller or a lot shorter or a lot broader than the pattern itself. So that's giving you an indication that you're probably going to need to make some amendments to the pattern before you start cutting out the garment. So one of the things that I recommend, especially if you're beginning or if you're making children's clothing, is to trace the pattern pieces off the master pattern that you're working from. So as far as children's sizes are concerned, you've got the option to then keep the pattern, and as they grow you can reuse, you can retrace bigger sizes from the master pattern. And with adults clothing, if you're making something for yourself, you've got the master pattern and you could make amendments to the one that you've traced off once you've made your mock-up garment and feel like you need to make some adjustments to it. So again, you've just got your master pattern left ready to use again if you do make a mistake on the traced off pattern. If you do decide to trace your pattern off, I have got a blog post with some tips and tricks for how to do that, so I'll add a link below for that. But my favourite tools are a tracing wheel like this, which has a wheel with little perforated, which perforates the paper as you roll it over the paper. And I also like the Spot and Cross pattern cutting paper, which I also use for making patterns. But you can literally lay your pattern on top of this and trace over it, and it will perforate the pattern just slightly and leave a dotted line on the paper below. And usually you can see well enough to cut round the paper, but if you do that, don't forget to also mark in the grain lines, and I'll talk about grain lines in a little bit, and there's also notch marks, so everything needs to be traced across so you've got all the information on your traced piece. So now, whether you're working from a traced pattern or you're working from your master pattern, you're going to want to cut out the size that you've chosen. So for this, it's always good to keep a spare pair of scissors that are for paper only, because cutting paper will blunt scissors, and if you're using your fabric scissors for both, then they're going to go blunt quite quickly. Now that we're ready to cut out the pattern, the one thing that I didn't mention just ahead of the tracing off is that if you have got multiple styles on a pattern, what I would do to start with is just look at the instructions and find out which pattern pieces that you need for that particular style. So say for example I'm doing style C here, so style C needs pieces 9 and 10 according to the instructions. So I can go, what I like to do is just go to the pattern and roughly cut out the pieces I need and put the other pieces away at this stage. So now I've got piece 9 here ready to cut out, and say I'm ready to cut out the size 14. I would then just really carefully, as accurately as possible, cut along the size 14 line. It's a little bit difficult to do it under the camera, but there you can see it's exactly on the line, and the pattern is now prepared and ready to use once I've cut the rest of that piece out. So once you've finished cutting out all your pieces of pattern for the style that you've chosen, you're ready to start placing the pattern pieces onto the fabric. So we'll bring in the instruction sheet again. So this is a commercial pattern layout, and you've got multiple different designs in this pattern. So we've selected, we're making style C, so we're going to be looking at the information for style C. Just as an example, this is one of my patterns, so this is the layout plan for that. Essentially it's exactly the same information but just in a slightly different format. So the first thing you'll notice is you've got multiple different layouts for each style, and that usually refers to the width of the fabric. So in this instance we've got 115 centimetres wide, and they're suggesting this is the layout for that width of fabric. If we turn to the back, we can see here there's two more layouts. So this is a different layout for 150 centimetre wide fabric, and then this is also 150 centimetres wide, but this is for larger sizes. So then the next thing you'll notice is information on the layout. So we've got selvage and we've got fold, and with this one we've got fold on both sides and selvages are together. So that's showing us how we need to lay the fabric. So on the edge of the fabric you'll have the selvages running down the length of the fabric. So if you've bought 2 meters of fabric, the 2 meter length will have the selvages on it, and this across the middle will be the width. That will be your 2 meter length. So if you fold your fabric so that your selvages are together and the fold is along the edge, and then place your pattern pieces in the way they've suggested it in the pattern, you should be able to fit the pieces easily and it should work. And likewise with this one, we're going to bring the selvage edges into the middle and have a fold on both sides to make those sizes fit. So there's quite a lot of information, but if it's not fitting, then there's an indication that either you haven't got the right amount of fabric, or perhaps you're looking at incorrectly looking at the the layout. So the next thing you'll notice is there are arrows on the pattern. So some arrows will be like this, and they'll usually have the instruction of place to fold or centre fold on the edge of a piece of pattern like this, with the arrowheads pointing towards the edge, which indicates that needs to be butted right up to the fold of the fabric. But if you have a piece of pattern with an arrow in the middle, then this needs to run parallel to either your fold edge or your selvage edge. Either one is fine, but the way to check that is by measurement. So I'm just going to show you how to do that now. So grain lines are quite important, just to give you a couple of reasons. Mainly the pattern or the garment will be designed to hang a certain way, and therefore the grain lines will be placed on the pattern when it's made to make the design hang in the way that the designer has intended. So to make your garment look the way it should do according to the pattern, you'd need to follow the grain lines as they are on the pattern. And another reason is, imagine this was a horizontal striped fabric or something with a very obvious design in it that was running across the fabric, and you started to place your grain line in all sorts of different directions, then that's exactly how your garment would look when it's made up if you cut them out in all sorts of different directions. So it's best really to always make sure you do follow the grain according to the to the pattern. So just to show you how to check your grain line is straight, place your pattern piece on and measure from the folded edge to one end of the arrow. So in this case it's 8 centimetres. So what you can do is just put a pin at that point on the pattern, and then I'm just going to deliberately make that go off line. I'm going to measure the other end of the arrow, and that's only measuring 7 centimetres. So I can pivot from that point and just check again, and now it's lined up. Now it's 8 centimetres at that end and 8 centimetres at that end. So the straight of grain is accurate on this pattern piece. So I can put another pin in there, and then I can carry on and pin around this whole piece so that it's ready to cut out. So when you are pinning on a tissue paper pattern like this, just make sure that the piece is nice and flat. I don't overly say that you need a certain amount of pins. It's just when you feel it's nicely held down and you feel confident to cut around it, that's what I suggest for pinning on a pattern piece. So I like to make a little checklist before I go ahead and finally pin all the pieces onto the fabric, because sometimes you might have a slightly different width, you might have made alterations to your pattern, there might be a number of reasons that your pattern pieces don't fit exactly the way the layout is in the pattern. So I just do a little checklist. How many pieces do you need of this pattern piece? And just also check that you definitely have got all the pieces that you need. So in this case I need 4 of these, and for this pattern piece I only need 1, but it needs to be on the fold. So check how many pieces and check where they need to be placed, whether it's against the fold or away from the fold, and then you can start to play around with the layout even if you're not exactly following what's in the pattern. And then what I would say is I'd go back to the instructions and just have a bit of a read through before you get started, and perhaps before you've even cut the garment out I'd have a look. But there's some key information I'd be looking for. One would be the seam allowance. What is the seam allowance allowed on your garment? And the other thing I'd be looking for is, do I need any other notions like a zip? Or am I making it in a jersey fabric? Do I need a special needle for my machine? Have everything prepared so that when you're ready to sew you can really get on with making it. So once you've laid your pattern out and it's all pinned on, you're ready to cut. There is another method that I sometimes like to use, particularly on thicker patterns, is that I would cut the pattern out, place the pattern onto the fabric and draw around it with chalk. And that's one of the methods that I recommend in my patterns, and I think it's particularly good if your paper is thick. But with tissue patterns, I think it's easier to actually pin them on, and then go ahead and cut around the pieces. So once you've cut all the pieces out, the next thing I would do is go round all the edges. I like to just go round systematically and look for any markings. So most commonly you'll come across little triangle markings like this, or circular markings like these. So the triangular ones that are right on the very edge of the pattern are basically a point that will match to another point at the same distance in. So for this shoulder, on the back shoulder, there'll be one to ensure that you've got the shoulder the right way round. It's just a little sort of jigsaw piece marking to help you make sure you've got everything in the right order. So with these, there's a number of ways you can mark them, and my preferred method is just to make a little snip. So imagine this is pinned onto the fabric. I just make a little snip through the fabric, no deeper than the depth of the triangle, just to show that it's there. But you need to make sure the snips are very small and they don't cut into the seam line. You can also mark these little points with chalk, but the problem is with chalk is it does tend to brush off as you make the garment, so sometimes you can't see it for very long. Some people also like to cut around and leave a little triangle above that triangle so that you can see a tiny bit of fabric sticking out. So either that method or the nick are quite good because you can see them from both sides of the fabric. And then lastly, there's these circular markings. So these are within the seam allowance. So you can't do nicks with these because they're actually in the centre of the fabric. So with these, you'd need to mark them with a tailor's chalk, or you can also do pin marking. So once you've done that with every pattern piece, you're ready to start making your garment. So I hope you found that useful. I'll be publishing part 3 very soon. If you did enjoy the video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and it would be great if you subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks for watching. See you soon.